Okay, so hello again, everybody. So this week, just like last, I've got sort of a short lecture presentation here, and this is, just like last time, meant to accompany your textbook reading, but hopefully also expand on what's in the textbook, provide a little clarity in case anything is uncertain based on your reading, and by and large, this is just meant to go beyond the textbook a little bit. So the topic for this coming week is social perception and causal attribution. And these are two closely related topics, so we'll talk about them both within this one presentation. So to begin by defining social perception, what we're talking about here is the study of how people form first impressions of other people and how we make inferences based on these impressions. So what I mean by this is that really within milliseconds of encountering another person, you'll start to get some idea of their likely personality traits, and you'll also start to think about the kind of behaviors that this person is most likely to engage in. So that's what I mean by forming impressions and making inferences about a person, sort of inferring what kind of actions a person is likely to engage in. And of course, when we form these initial impressions of a person and we start making inferences about the kind of behaviors that they're likely to engage in, this ends up affecting our feelings and our behavior towards another person. So if you meet somebody and you instantly feel comfortable around that person, you'll start to make some inferences about this person, that they're friendly, perhaps that they are trustworthy, and because of this, you will act in a manner that is friendly and open and engaging towards this person. So a couple things worth noting about first impressions. One is that they occur automatically. So in that brief introductory lecture that I gave last week, I talked about this idea of automatic social cognition, things that we do basically without trying, things that just happen. And first impressions are an example of this automatic cognition. They are something that just happened. They're basically reflexive. As soon as you see a person, if you're paying any attention to them at all, you will form some impression about this person. So what kind of things shape or influence our first impressions of another person? Well, mostly they are physical characteristics of the person. Things like the appearance of their face, the tone and the inflection of their voice, shape of their body, and their gestures and their emotional expressions, their nonverbal behavior. So I want to give a really quick example of how this process plays out on the next slide. So in this example, I'm going to show you two pictures, and they're just pictures of someone's face. They're two different people. And just imagine in a hypothetical scenario that these two people ask you to borrow $20. And you don't know anything else about these people other than how they look. So just judging on their appearance, which of the two would you be more likely to let borrow $20? And of course, if someone's asking to borrow money, the deal is that they're going to pay you back. So with that in mind, would you be more willing to loan $20 to person A or to person B? And in all likelihood, you chose person B, which is the same person that about 90% of people will choose if asked this question between person A and person B, who would you let borrow $20? And why? It's hard to say, right? You don't really know anything about these people at all. You have no prior or additional information. All you have to go on is their appearance. And in this context, person B just looks more trustworthy, right? They just seem like the safer option here, despite the fact you know nothing about these people for real. And in all likelihood, you answered the question, who would you let borrow $20? Person A or person B? You answered that in no time whatsoever, right? That first impression that person A just looks a little sleazy and person B seems relatively friendly, relatively trustworthy, that just happened, right? It's just reflexive. It's an automatic impression that you're going to form of these two people. But because of that, now your behavior towards these people has been influenced. In this case, how willing you are to let them borrow some money. So to follow up on that example, what kind of things, right? What were the cues that were just in those people's faces that led you to have such different impressions of their trustworthiness or of their friendliness? Well, right, you can manipulate certain key features of a person's face. And as you start to change things like the prominence of their brow ridge or the thickness of their chin, how much space there is between their eyes, as you start to play around with these aspects of a person's face and how they look, somewhat naturally, your impression of the person will change. And what this image is just showing you is what kind of features tend to lead people to think a person looks trustworthy or looks untrustworthy. And things like having a really deep indentation between the eyes, having a really strong brow ridge, and shallow cheekbones, right? These features tend to be associated with impressions of untrustworthiness. Whereas the opposite features, things like pronounced cheekbones, a relatively shallow indentation between the eyes, a kind of soft brow ridge, people that have these face features, we tend to form relatively positive first impressions of them. We tend to think that they're somewhat trustworthy. And here's an interesting thing. So here I want to switch gears a little bit and move away from talking about how a person's face or body appearance changes first impressions. And I want to talk a little bit about the role of nonverbal communication in social perception as well. So when we talk about nonverbal behavior or nonverbal communication, what I mean is sending and receiving information using gestures, expressions, vocal cues, and body movements instead of words. One point of clarification here is the inclusion of vocal cues in this definition sounds a little bit strange, but the idea is that the way you say something can convey information in addition to the words that you're using. So the classic example of this is sarcasm. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm really happy for you," you know that they're not actually happy for you. So this counts as nonverbal communication because the tone of their voice, the inflection they used, changed the meaning of the words. So it was their vocal cues that were really sending information, not the words they were using. So anyway, this idea of nonverbal communication is something that gets studied a lot for people who are interested in social perception, because to send or to receive information without words requires being a very astute social perceiver, picking up on other people's oftentimes very subtle changes in eye gaze or expression or the shifting of their body movements that convey very important meanings to us. So because really subtle aspects of our nonverbal behavior can send a lot of information, there are of course times where we want to control our nonverbal behavior. And when we do this, when we attempt to control the information that we're sending with our nonverbals, this is called nonverbal regulation. So the classic example of this is the well-known poker face. Folks who play poker will try to conceal or hide from their competitors whether or not they have a good hand or a bad hand. And one way they do this is by not revealing anything with their face. If they get a really good hand, they don't smile, they don't smirk, they don't grin, they stay neutral. If they have a really bad hand, they do the same thing. They don't frown, they don't fret, they just keep a nice neutral face. And this is it's known as a poker face. But this is a nice example of nonverbal regulation. And there are any number of instances throughout the day where everybody, even if not playing poker, will attempt to regulate their nonverbal behavior. If you have to give a presentation in a class and you're nervous, sometimes this will show, right? Your nervousness might be conveyed nonverbally through your hands shaking or through sweating, and you might want to try to control these things if you have to give a presentation. And this is what's known as nonverbal regulation. It's just reining in the signals that we send with our body. But doing this is effortful. It's not an easy thing, right? If you've ever been in a situation where you're trying to regulate your nonverbal behaviors, maybe you, when you were a kid, you're 14 or 15 or something, and your parents are getting on your case about cleaning your room, and you want to roll your eyes desperately, and you want to be like, ugh, right? You want to demonstrate and clearly convey how annoyed you are with your parents, but you know better, right? You know you can't get away with doing that, so you try to regulate your nonverbal behaviors. You try not to reveal your irritation to your parents, but doing this is difficult. It's effortful. And sometimes it doesn't always work. And when nonverbals kind of accidentally give us away, when they reveal that we're nervous or we're angry or annoyed or really sad, this is known as nonverbal leakage. And because nonverbal regulation, because controlling our nonverbal behavior requires effort, that means that sometimes we don't do it perfectly. So again, these two pictures that are being displayed here, on the top we've got a poker player, and he's putting his chips in, he's placing a bet, and I think he's got a pretty good poker face up on the top there. I have no idea whether he's confident in his bet, whether he's got a good hand or a bad hand, and that means he's doing his job. He is regulating his nonverbals really well. But this guy here on the bottom with the hat, if you had to guess, does he have a good hand or a bad hand right now? Probably a bad hand. And what is it that's giving him away? Now here's an interesting thing. What's giving him away isn't really his face. If you look just at his face, tucked underneath that hat of his, right, if you look just at his face, it's pretty neutral, just like the guy on top. So this player down here on the bottom who looks dejected, he's not showing his dejection through his face. So where is he leaking? What nonverbals are leaking that are giving away his dejection? Now, it's actually his posture for the most part, right? Eye gaze and posture. He's looking down, he's not looking at anybody in particular, right? He's just gazing down, and his shoulders look kind of slumped, and he's just kind of hanging there in his seat. So even though he's actually managed to maintain a poker face, the rest of his body is giving him away. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. We can regulate our facial expressions pretty well. You can fake a smile if you have to, you can suppress laughter if you have to, whatever it might be. You can control your face pretty well. But doing this, regulating your facial expression, requires a lot of your cognitive energy. You have to try to regulate your facial expressions. So when you're devoting all of your attention to regulating your face, this means that you're not paying attention to what the rest of your body is doing. And when that happens, things like your posture can start to leak. So the player at the bottom, who is presumably about to lose what looks like about $6 million, lots of money, right, he's about to lose out on an enormous pot, and he's doing okay regulating his face. He's not expressing that much sadness, but he's leaking his dejection elsewhere, mostly in his posture and his gaze. So everything that we've talked about up until now, things like someone's face appearance or their nonverbal behaviors, their facial expressions, their eye gaze, these are things that will shape our impression of another person and that will influence our behavior towards them. So they play an important role in social perception processes. But things like someone else's appearance or their expressions, these exert what's known as a bottom-up influence on our social perception. So, right, things like face structure or nonverbal, those are bottom-up influences. And what that means is that when you rely on someone's appearance or their gestures or their tone of voice, when you use that information to form an impression of them, and that is all you know about a person, that means you're building your impression, or you're forming it from the bottom up, from the ground up. You're building an impression of someone. And you're using information that that person sends to you, right? And what I mean by that is that you're using information that another person's face broadcasts to you, or that another person sends to you with their nonverbal behaviors. So this is information that's provided by the stimulus, information provided by the other person. But what are known as top-down influences can also change or influence our social perception. So as an example of this, if you're meeting someone for the very first time, but you expect them to be a really nice person, this expectation that you are bringing with you is going to influence your first impressions of the person. Or if on the very first day of class, the first day of the semester, you're taking a class and you've never met the professor before, but one of your friends has taken them in the past and says that they are like a really difficult professor. You're going to go into class on that first day with this prior knowledge and this expectation about the professor. And because you have this information, you have this expectation and this prior knowledge, this is going to color your first impression of this professor. It's going to lead you to think or to interpret their actions in a way that's consistent with your expectations. So you'll leave class that day and say, man, my friend was right, that professor, they seem like they're going to be really tough. But in this case, right, your first impression, it was not shaped by the professor's appearance or their nonverbal behaviors. Your impression was shaped by your prior knowledge and your expectations and beliefs. And these are top-down influences. And another top-down influence that can really powerfully shape our social perception processes is the context in which you meet someone. So I want to give a visual example of what I mean by context as a top-down influence on impression formation or on social perception. So if I show you this woman's face right here and I ask you, what is she expressing? It's actually a little bit ambiguous. Maybe it's pain, maybe it's rage, who knows, right? Hard to tell. And if you can't tell from just her face alone, that means that you're not getting enough bottom-up information, right? That this woman's face, the stimulus, is not providing you with a really good or satisfactory answer to what is she expressing, what is she feeling. And when this occurs, right, it's actually somewhat frustrating for us because we want to know. It's a natural part of our social perception to want to understand what other people are feeling. It's part of forming impressions and coming up with inferences, trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. But what if I give you a little bit of context that helps you disambiguate her expression? Showing you a bigger picture, for instance, you can now see that, all right, she's an athlete, she's playing tennis, so now you have other cues, you have more information around than just what her face was sending you, for instance. You can see her face now in this broader context. And part of that context are other aspects of her nonverbals, her fist pump, but you can also just get more of the scene. You get more of the social situation here. You see that she was playing a sport, it's tennis, so now when you combine everything, all of this information together, you can understand that she's not in pain and she's not angry, she just won. And she's really feeling it. She just won. And that's cool. But now that you have all of this additional information available, all of this context that helps you understand her face expression, that context is a top-down influence. And you can imagine how these top-down influences are almost always at play when it comes to forming impressions of other people. So even if someone has a face that makes them look kind of trustworthy, and that's bottom-up information, you're probably going to feel a little bit more comfortable around that person if you meet them in a nice, well-lit office than if you meet them in a dark, shady back alley. And that's because the context that you're meeting them in is going to exert an influence on how you feel about this person. So I just want to lay this out a little bit because this distinction between top-down and bottom-up processing can be a little bit tricky sometimes. And really, top-down and bottom-up processes are sort of always interacting, or kind of always happening at the same time, because as you first meet somebody and you form an impression of them, right, you're going to sort of take in their appearance, how they're dressed, what they look like. You're going to attend to their nonverbal behavior, the sound of their voice and their gestures and their facial expressions. You're going to get all of that. But maybe the room in which you meet them also changes your impression of them. And maybe you have some expectation about this person, and that's going to change your first impression of them. So you've got all these bottom-up and these top-down factors co-occurring at the same time. And they ultimately end up being very influential when it comes to shaping our social perception. So another important social perception process, and one that your book spends a lot more time on than the stuff we were just talking about, is causal attribution. And I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly because your textbook goes into a lot of detail about attribution processes. But aside from forming impressions about a person's personality characteristics and traits, that's an important part of social perception, but we also like to know why people do what they do. And this is causal attribution. It's basically coming up with explanations for people's behavior, what makes them do what they do. And these attributions also have a really important impact in terms of how we interact with other people and how we feel about them. So, as an example, imagine that you ask somebody out on a date and they say no. So, how you feel about this, right, your personal feelings and even how you think about this other person now that they've turned you down, that's going to depend on the attribution you come up with for why they said no. And maybe this person says, no, but thanks for asking, that's really flattering, however, I'm in a relationship. If that's why they turn you down, all right, fine, that's not about you, that's not so bad. But if they say no, and then they start laughing, and they take out their phone, and they immediately start texting their friends to be like, oh my god, you're never going to believe what just happened, you're going to feel pretty terrible. Right? Because your attribution for why they said no is now very different. Your explanation is not that they're in a relationship, which is sort of a soft letdown, right? But it's that they just don't like you. And that's a lot worse. So these attributions are very, very important. Attributions play a role in the legal system. So when it comes to, for instance, trying to find the motive for a crime, this is a big deal. People like to know, why would someone commit a crime in the first place? What was their motive? When people talk about motive, what they're really talking about is an attribution. It's coming up for an explanation for why someone might commit a crime. So when we talk about attributions, to make this really simple, the question is basically, how do we explain other people's behavior? But we also come up with attributions for ourselves sometimes. We also like to come up with explanations for why we do what we do. And when we come up with these explanations for other people's behavior and for our own, there's one really central distinction. And this is elaborated in Fritz Heider's naive attribution theory. And this is the distinction between internal and external attributions. So when we come up with explanations for why other people do what they do, or for why we do what we do, these attributions usually hinge on this internal or external distinction. And if we're making an internal attribution, this means that we're explaining behavior based on personality traits or some enduring quality of the person. If we make external attributions, we are instead explaining behavior based on something in the environment, something in the situation that makes someone do what they do. So, for instance, if you get an A on a test in some class, and someone asks you, man, how did you do that? If you say, I'm just really smart, That's an internal attribution, because you're explaining your excellent test performance, right? You're attributing it to some internal quality, something about you. I'm really smart. But you could also say, oh, I got an A because I have an excellent tutor who helped me a lot. And if that's what you say, well, that's more of an external attribution, right? Because there was something about your situation, there's something about your environment that helped you out. In this case, it would be a tutor. And this distinction between internal and external attributions is a really critical one, especially because we don't make internal and external attributions equally often for other people and for ourselves. So let me explain that a little bit on the next slide. So there is something known as the fundamental attribution error. And to give the fancy definition of it, it's when a person infers or believes that someone else's behavior is indicative of a stable personality trait or characteristic. Essentially what it means is that we tend to think that other people's behavior is caused by something about their personality. So we explain other people's actions in terms of internal qualities, meaning we make internal attributions for explaining other people's behavior. And in doing so, we tend to ignore the situational or external factors that might actually be influencing someone else's behavior. So as an example of this, imagine when you're driving and someone cuts you off. What do you think of that person who's just cut you off? You think they're a jerk. So essentially you're answering the question, why did this person cut me off? You're answering it by saying, they cut me off because they're a jerk. And that is an internal attribution. There was something about them, about their character, about their personality that made them cut you off. But what you don't know is the situational factor that maybe actually really caused them to cut you off. Maybe they are in a rush because they just got a call that a loved one is in the hospital and they desperately need to get there, so they're cutting off everybody on the road. But you don't know about that. You don't know about their situation because it is not perceptually salient. And what perceptual salience means is basically how obvious or how noticeable is something. And generally speaking, someone else's situation is not very obvious. So if someone cuts you off while they're driving, what stands out? Their behavior, their action, the fact that they cut you off. And that is really the only thing you know for sure about this person. You don't know anything about their situation. You have no idea if they're rushing to the hospital to attend to a sick loved one. You have no idea if they're running really late for work and they don't want to get fired. So none of that is available to you. It's not perceptually salient. You don't know it. And because of that, it's not on your mind when you come up with an attribution for this other person's behavior. Now, of course, when we explain our own behavior, we are usually acutely aware of the situation that we're in. So if you cut someone off while you're driving, is it because you're a jerk? Probably not. You know that you cut them off because you've got a loved one in the hospital or you're really late for work and you've got to hurry. So your situation is perceptually salient. But the person that you just cut off, they don't know anything about your situation. And as far as they're concerned, you cut them off because you're a jerk. So this explains the fundamental attribution error. We are much more inclined, much more prone to explain other people's actions as being caused by their personality, something inside them. And we don't do this for ourselves very often. And the reason is because of how salient or how obvious the situational factors are. And we tend to know about our own situation, but we don't know about other people's. And because of that, we assume that other people's behavior is caused by their personality. But of course, right, this is usually an error. And that's why this was called the fundamental attribution error, because it's a mistake. One thing that we know and that we'll learn about throughout this entire semester is that behavior gets pushed around by the situation all the time. We're constantly being influenced by external variables, things in the situation, but so too are other people. And if we ignore those situational factors when we explain other people's behavior, we're usually making an error. We're oftentimes going to be wrong. Our attributions will be incorrect. So that's why this is called the fundamental attribution error. Now, in addition to perceptual salience, attributions can be influenced by other additional information as well. And Kelly's covariation theory explains this pretty nicely. So to run you through Kelly's covariation model, let me give you an example. Imagine that you show up to work 20 minutes late one day. Now, if it's your first day on the job and your bosses don't know anything about you, well, now they're forming a bottom-up impression of you based only pretty much on your lateness. And based on the fundamental attribution error that we just talked about, your boss is probably going to assume that you're late because of something about you. Now, that might not be true, right? Maybe the buses and trains were running late, maybe there was terrible traffic, so there could be an external reason that you were late, but none of that is salient or obvious to your boss. So if it's your very first day and they don't know anything else about you, they're probably going to commit the fundamental attribution error and just assume that you're lazy or irresponsible, and that's no good. But what if you've been working somewhere for a year? So now your boss has a whole bunch of information about you. They know how you normally behave. They know how other people in your workplace behave. They've got a lot of information available. So you've been working there for a year, and now you show up an hour late. So whether your boss makes an internal or an external attribution for your lateness, now it's going to be influenced by a couple of other factors. One is consensus. So this means, how is everyone else behaving that day? Now, if you roll into work 20 minutes late and everyone else is there on time, that means there's low consensus. You were basically the only person late. That's not so good. But maybe everybody was running late that day. Okay, so now consensus is high. Most people are late. So when your boss explains this behavior, they are likely to make an external attribution because consensus is high. Everybody's late. So there must have been something going on that caused the lateness. But there's also information about consistency. So if you roll into work 20 minutes late, are you usually late? Is this something that you do regularly? All right, do you usually behave like this? And if you being late is a consistent thing, then even if there's a lot of traffic and everyone else is late, your boss might still make an internal attribution because you're always late anyway. But if consistency is low, that would mean that you rarely arrive to work late. You're very punctual. If that's the case, this is an inconsistent behavior for you. That's further evidence that something weird was happening, that there must have been some external factor that made you late. And then lastly, there's distinctiveness. And if you've been working somewhere for a year, maybe you become friends with your boss and your coworkers, and sometimes you hang out outside of work. This gives your boss an opportunity to observe your behavior in multiple situations, at work and outside of work. And this allows them to know if your showing up to work 20 minutes late is distinctive. Or are you 20 minutes late to work, but you're also regularly 20 minutes late to hang out with everybody at happy hour or to show up for the movies or whatever? Are you just a kind of person who, across all different situations, is usually running late? And this is distinctiveness. So you've got these three additional pieces of information: consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness. And together, they can all sort of be put together. It's kind of like a Rubik's Cube almost. They could be all put together to push around whether or not someone makes an internal or an external attribution. But for Kelly's covariation model to come into play, a person has to have these data, has to have this information available to them. They have to be able to know how a person usually behaves, how other people usually behave, and how a person behaves across different situations. And if you don't have all those pieces, Kelly's covariation model isn't necessarily relevant. But if you know a lot about a person, you can use this information to help shape your attributions for their behavior. So that's where I'm going to stop for now. I just want to end with the usual reminders. Things that are due this week are the same that are due pretty much every week. Be sure you make your discussion board posts. Complete your weekly quiz. Again, you've got 2 attempts. Highest one counts. And in addition, I have posted some videos up on Blackboard that some of them are kind of fun little videos that are about person perception and nonverbal behavior. And then there's another one that's up there about Kelly's covariation model. This just gives another example of it. So feel free to watch those. You're not obligated to, but I think they'll be helpful and they can be kind of interesting too. So go check all that stuff out. As always, if you have questions, feel free to email me or post them straight up on the Q&A message board. So thanks for listening.